Okay, I think we're on. All right, so what I want to do is I want to make a few observations which will be a continuation of what I've been talking about. I've been speaking to you about the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi in my concluding remarks on Tuesday. I want to wrap up that discussion, just reiterate a few points, and then I want to start looking at the Constitution of India, the Constituent Assembly, and I want to look at the question of India as a democracy in broad terms, right? In broad terms, because the question of India as a democracy is something that interests us, throughout the quarter. That will interest us throughout the quarter, and we'll keep on returning to that question whenever we look at political movements, at attempts at secession, at ethnic conflict, how the Indian state responds to demands made by various kinds of constituencies, such as women, Dalits, working classes. So that's a question that we're not going to wrap up today, obviously, but it's a question that will persist with us throughout the course. And I also want to look at a number of things that come into place in independent India immediately after independence in 1947. Let me just reiterate what I mentioned to you about Gandhi's assassination. So the argument that I'd advanced based on the reading that you have done by Ashish Nandi, there are others who have now made that argument as well, but essentially the argument was that this is an assassination that is not to be understood simply as a retaliation by a Hindu, an upper caste Hindu, a Maharashtrian Brahmin, which is what Nathuram Godse was, against a fellow Hindu who he thought had betrayed the country. Right? That's obviously the simplest explanation that one could come to, and very often people did view it that way. But one of the things that Nandi was trying to argue was that in order to understand this assassination and locate it within a set of factors, what we have to consider is the fact that Gandhi had in fact actually endeavored to place people who had been at the periphery of life in India. He had put them onto the center. And people who had been the traditional elites had, as a consequence of Gandhian politics, become marginalized in India. Right? And this certainly, according to Nandi, is one of the major reasons why somebody like Nathuram Godse felt tempted to assassinate Gandhi and carry out the assassination successfully. And by the way, there was an attempt on Gandhi's life just 10, 12 days before he was actually shot dead. It was an attempt made by him by a group of young people. And in fact, when Gandhi was shot dead, the government of India claimed that there was a conspiracy which involved a number of men, not just the person who was the assassin himself. Of course, he was going to be tried, and he was going to be one of two men who was eventually going to be executed as a consequence of the conviction. Right? But the government of India claimed that there was a larger conspiracy, and I'm not persuaded that there was a conspiracy in the sense in which the government of India claimed that there was a conspiracy, but what Nandi is suggesting is that there was in fact a much larger conspiracy than we have hitherto imagined, because Nathuram Godse effectively represented the point of view of Indian middle-class elites. And these Indian middle-class elites had come to the conclusion that Gandhi was a man who frankly was a liability for independent India, a liability, because he was this man in his late 70s who was a critic of industrial civilization, a critic of modernity, who was effeminate, and these middle-class Indian elites had come to the point of view that a independent India in the modern nation-state system that we have today, which defines world politics, that such a nation-state under the leadership, even the moral leadership of Gandhi, could not in fact actually survive and flourish. And therefore this man in fact had to be killed. Right? So that is effectively the argument that Nandi is advancing, where he's suggesting that there were quite a few people, notwithstanding the fact that Gandhi was revered as the Mahatma, as the great soul, and so forth and so on, that there were quite a few people, especially the middle class elites, who had decided that Gandhi in fact was a liability and therefore had to be done away with. And to that extent, we can say that there were many people who were complicit in the assassination. All right? And one of the last points I had made in my previous lecture was to suggest that there were other complicated things going on here too, such as this whole politics of sexuality, the politics of masculinity, that Gandhi was seen as somebody who was effeminate, right? And Nathuram Godse stood for a kind of a hyper-masculinity, right? And one of the things that what Nandi does in this piece is he actually looks at Nathuram's biography. And I'm not going to reconstruct the argument for you because I think you have to read the piece for yourself, but if you've read the piece, you will understand exactly what I mean when I say that, according to Nandi, Godse represented a certain kind of hyper-masculinity. Now, let me move on to a number of other considerations. Right? So the two big considerations for today are the question of democracy, the emergence of India as a democracy. I mean, it's very often remarked that India is singularly one of the states which achieved independence after long years of colonial rule, one of the few states that achieved independence which went on to become a democracy. I mean, remember that in the 20th century, if you're looking at Asia and Africa, and a number of other parts of the world, but principally Asia and Africa, we're saying that the principal movement of the 20th century was in fact decolonization, right? Where countries that had been under colonial rule, whether it was British colonial rule or Dutch colonial rule, as in the case of Indonesia, or French colonial rule, as in the case of Indochina, that is Vietnam, right? Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, that area. Of course, there were other French colonies such as Algeria. Whether it was French rule, Dutch rule, British rule, or any other European power from whom countries got their independence, the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, is a period of decolonization. And of these dozens of states that emerged, how many of them went on to become full-fledged democracies? And so one of the things that is claimed for India is that, in fact, India was more or less singular in this. And if you look at South Asia itself, we know that there was Pakistan, of course, and Pakistan has had very few years of what you would call democratic rule. A large part of Pakistan's history since 1947 has been either military dictatorship or other forms of authoritarianism. And of course we know that Sri Lanka was ravaged by an intense civil war that went on for several decades. Right? So forth and so on. One could obviously, give other illustrations of this, and one could turn to Africa. But let's just assume that this is the case. Then the question that obviously arises is, well, to what extent should we really consider India to be a democracy? Now, before we take this up in a broad vein, and before I engage you in a discussion, because I would like to have a bit of a discussion so that I'm quite certain that we all agree, at least minimally, upon what we mean when we say a democracy. Because if, for example, someone said that, well, a democracy is rather simple to define. It's simple to define because it's one person, one vote. Well, if it's one person, one vote, then clearly the United States was not a democracy. If we simply take that definition, was not a democracy, notwithstanding what they say in America itself about this being the oldest democracy in the world, going back to the second half of the 18th century when the Declaration of Independence was issued, and following that, more importantly, the Constitution of the United States was drawn up. So if we say one person, one vote, we know that a substantial portion of the population of this country did not have the vote at that time. African Americans did not have the vote. Women did not have the vote until the 20th century. Right? And so then, of course, you could say that, well, yes, but democracies are evolving. Maybe the United States was not a perfect democracy. And of course, I think we should be always resistant to use the phrase perfect democracy, because there is no such thing. We know that. And of course, some people have said that, well, democracy is the best of all the political systems. They're all horrid. They're all horrendous. They all have their problems, whether it's authoritarianism or military dictatorship or totalitarianism or monarchies, right? Because then there are different kinds of democracies as well. There are democracies that are still in principle, under monarchical rule. In principle, I say, because Britain, for example, has the Queen, and some people would argue, many students of politics would argue, well, that the Queen is a mere figurehead. The Queen has no power at all. Actually, I'm not quite sure that's really the case, but But we can't delve into that in very substantial detail at this point for obvious reasons, because that will take us to a completely different plane. But nonetheless, that would be an argument that would be commonly made. But we do know that in Britain there is a distinction between the head of government and the head of state. You do not have that distinction in the United States. There's no such distinction in the United States. But in Britain and in countries which have adopted the British system, there is such a distinction. So India has a president and a prime minister, right? Both. Right? But the president is supposed to be a figurehead. And this figurehead only becomes important when you have a constitutional crisis. What would a constitutional crisis look like? A constitutional crisis could arise when the government in power is not able to command a majority in Parliament. The same thing in Britain. So in Britain, let's supposing that you have, so you've got the Tories, the Conservative Party, and then you have the Labour Party, and let's supposing that the party in power, the present Prime Minister of Britain is David Cameron, and let's supposing we were at a scenario where David Cameron's party had a razor-thin majority, and that owing to some political problem, that 30 people in his party decide that they're not going to support him any longer. Right? Now that could lead to a constitutional crisis, because if you have a razor-thin majority and 30 people in your party no longer support you, you lose that razor-thin majority. So what are they going to do? They're going to call for a vote in the House of Commons. And when you call for a vote in the House of Commons, which is the equivalent of the House of Representatives in the American system, you call for a vote, and the ruling party under Cameron cannot command a majority. When the vote is taken, the government falls at that point. And when the government falls, then the Queen is going to come into the picture, because she has to decide what is she going to do. Is she going to call for fresh elections? Or is she going to try to come to some kind of political arrangement? Because there may be a third political party, and the third political party could form a coalition with the opposition, and they could now become the government. So you see, the Queen is not a mere figurehead. I could give you many illustrations of that. But let's assume, for the most part, that the Queen is a figurehead. And the American system, we don't even have that distinction, because the head of government and the head of the state are exactly the same person. And in India, we have a similar distinction, and we could have a similar problem in India as we have had in this scenario that I've described to you, as in Britain. Okay? So these are just some rudimentary considerations when we start to think about, well, what does it mean when we speak about a democracy? And this is, of course, these are all technical definitions, if you ask me, because we haven't spoken at all about the spirit of democracy. So far, we're only adhering to some kind of legalistic conception, and we're saying, well, one person, one vote. And then I'm saying to you that, well, historically, that was not the case, frankly, with any democracy that we know of. In fact, one of the unique things about the Indian Constitution is that it gives universal suffrage. Universal suffrage means one person, one vote. Doesn't matter whether you're a working class person or you're a woman, you're a tribal, every adult person gets a vote. And each vote is, in principle, equivalent to another vote. Right? So the Indian Constitution, immediately in the 1952 election, which was the first election held after independence, that gave universal suffrage. And at that time, the number of people who were entitled to vote was about 185 million. Sometimes these figures might be a little off, because I'm just reading them off memory rather than looking through notes, and I don't always remember, and the figures may be a little bit inaccurate, but something in that neighborhood of about 185 million. And I think it was about 105 million people who actually cast their vote in the first election in 1952. By comparison, just think of it this way, India just carried out a huge exercise, okay, of electoral democracy, as I'm sure some of you here know. When Narendra Modi got elected earlier this year, in the months of April and May, when the elections were carried out, and just by way of comparison, the electorate, that is the people who are actually entitled to vote, was about 850 million. 850 million. And I think the number of people who actually cast their vote in this last election was something in the neighborhood of about 600 million plus. 600 million. All right? I mean, there's nothing comparable in the world to that exercise. You can be a real critic and you can scoff at it and you can say, well, those are just numbers. What does it really mean? Right? It's possible to take that view. And of course, when you have 600 million people casting their vote and you've got over half a million polling stations, places where you can go and cast your ballot. Okay? And then, of course, you have to remember that there are people living in small, isolated communities, and the endeavor of the Indian government, as is the endeavor over here, that when you have an election here, there may be a small remote outpost somewhere in Alaska. Well, technically, you're supposed to be able to get the ballot to them. And if it means that there are only 2 people living there in that little village, or 10 people, well, you have to take a helicopter there and be able to give them the ballot. That's what it means. And of course, we heard such stories in 2014 when the Indian election was carried out. All right? So here are some different aspects of this story. But now let's take a slightly different substantive view and say, well, what does it mean for a country to be called a democracy? Would someone venture to say what they think is a good working definition of a democracy? Other than simply saying, you can say that, but then add something to it, that a democracy means one person, one vote. I think we understand that that's now the minimum that is required. But is it something else beyond one person, one vote? Yes?
A democracy is a system where everybody gets to voice what they believe, the direction the government should take, and they get to vote for whichever person they feel best suits their interests.
Okay. But that's effectively the one person, one vote, right? Wouldn't you say? I mean, it's a slightly more elaborate description of that short.
Well,
you threw in some
multiple candidates, because you can have one person, one vote, but if there's only one candidate on the
Okay.
ballot.
So is that a little bit like saying, I mean, I'm not being completely ironical here, but is it a little bit like saying, because you're saying that it includes choice. That's what I understood you when you said there are multiple candidates. So it's a little bit like walking into Ralph's. You want to buy a cereal, so there are 100 boxes of cereal there, and you pick one. So is it choice in the same sense? Or is it substantively different? And how much choice, by the way, do you have here in any case? Because effectively, this is a two-party system. I think you will all have to agree with me that it's a two-party system. And yes, you may have something called the Socialist Party. There is even, by the way, and there are representatives of that party on this campus that I happen to know. There is even something called the Communist Party of the United States of America. I don't know how many of you know how many members it has. You want to make a guess? Sorry? 5,000. That's pretty good. You're being a little bit generous. A little bit generous. 5,000 is pretty good. 2,000. That's its membership in the United States. The Communist Party of the United States, of course, they've got pamphlets and literature, and they try to make as much noise as they can. But with 2,000 members, what are you going to do, right? And is there a real effective third party in this country? Hasn't been for the last 100 years. You don't really have a third party in this country for the last 100 years. So what you have is Republicans and Democrats. Now, if you ask me, that's like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Okay? If you know Alice in Wonderland, that's what it is. Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's no difference. They both stand for capitalism. They both stand for gun rights, for the NRA. I could give you a whole list, a mile long, to show what are the similarities between the two parties from my point of view. Right? Yes, someone could say that, well, there are some substantive domestic differences. For example, under Obama, we had Affordable Health Care Act, and it's unlikely that under a Republican president that something like this would have happened. I would concede that. That's an illustration of where there may, in fact, actually be a difference. But after all, Tweedledee and Tweedledum have some differences too, Okay? And that's precisely the point, that one we have to think about is, well, what are the real substantive differences, and then what are the differences that are largely cosmetic or that are largely dictated by immediate contingencies. So you cannot have a third party which says that, well, we're going to offer a fundamental critique of the whole institution of capitalism. That's not possible in the United States. Or that we're going to have a third party which is going to offer a fundamental critique of the notion of property. Or a third party which is going to say that, well, we can't have people making $50 billion and then have people making $20,000 a year. There's something particularly inhumane about it. It's not possible, because you do have to understand that the differences between the top 0.1% of the population and the bottom 80% of the population in the US, this difference is much vaster than the difference in any other democracy, especially in Europe or in Japan. I mean, in Japan, the differential might be 100 to 1. Here, the differential is going to be 5,000 to 1. Okay, between what somebody is making at the very top, or 50,000 to 1, right? I mean, I was reading a book about Bill Gates. This is when, about 15 years ago, when his wealth was just way above anyone else's. Now there's quite a few competitors over there. And it said that, if Bill Gates was walking along the road, and let's supposing there was a $1,000 bill. There isn't a $1,000 bill, but let's supposing there was a $1,000 bill, and that if he dropped a $1,000 bill accidentally, it would be more expensive for him to stop, and he realized 5 seconds later it would be more expensive for him to stop, go back and pick it up from the street than to just continue on. That's how much money he makes. Okay? Right? So the question here is, now you see what I'm doing. I'm simply saying, well, the definition that we have doesn't speak about equality. Doesn't even remotely speak about equality. In fact, actually in the US, I think it would be very difficult to give a definition of democracy which would even remotely include the word equality. At the most, people would say there can be equality of opportunity. Okay, which of course is a way of evading the whole question, because what is the equality of opportunity for somebody who goes to Harvard and somebody who's in an American Indian reservation? I mean, I want to know, what is the equality of opportunity there, strictly speaking? And of course, then there are people who will have an answer, and they will say, yeah, but if the person in the reservation really struggled, he or she could make something of themselves, and they could go to Harvard. So in other words, the reason why they don't go is because they're lazy. Now, you see, these are all euphemisms. And this is a standard word that is available in the lexicon. It's just there that you plug it in. When you think that you want to explain why some people are not able to advance in life. Well, they just happen to be lazy. So, now you don't have to agree with any of this at all, but I'm trying to suggest to you, let's see whether we can give some kind of, because fundamentally my interest is in this course, is in critiquing the idea that we do have a democracy in India, but not offering such a wholesale critique as some of my friends have done, where we say, well, frankly, there's no democracy in India at all, because if there isn't any, then we'd have to say, well, what is a system that we really do have there? Is it simply an oligarchy? An oligarchy is ruled by the rich, because if it's an oligarchy, then certainly that's the United States. That's probably a good definition of the United States. This is an oligarchy. I mean, there are 50 families, 50 people who control 95% of the wealth of the United States. Right? That's an oligarchy, as far as I'm concerned. And that's true. You just look up the numbers. You don't have to rely upon any numbers I give you. You just go and look them up and see who has what kind of wealth and what is their wealth in proportion to the wealth of people at the bottom. Yes?
So I guess one could say that on paper, or at least principally, a democracy is a system by which all constituents of the nations they have are represented by the government. But in reality, or if you delve deeper, more than likely, it's not really, people are not really represented by the government. It's whoever can buy the most amount of influence, or whoever can appeal to people in power.
Okay, that would be I think something that, broadly speaking, yes, I would be able to go along with. I would be able to accept, and I suspect that most people would. That in paper, the democracy may be something that it's not quite in reality. But let's see if we can then translate this, because I think you would agree with me that there's probably a gap between the ideal and the reality with almost every institution. Every institution you can think of in the world, including this university, right? Whatever its representation might be by the chancellor or by the administration, well, and then what happens at the ground level, there's going to be a gap there. So there's always a gap there. So then we could say that perhaps a democracy is a work in progress, right? It's a process. It's a process. And that this is what perhaps distinguishes it from other political systems, which may not be works in progress in the same way, that there isn't that kind of process. And this is why it's important to understand that clearly that there is some merit in saying that the United States was a democracy from the second half of the 18th century, even though the majority of the people of the United States in the second half of the 18th century could not vote. Because there were other restrictions too. You couldn't vote if you were black, you couldn't vote if you were a woman, okay? And you couldn't vote if you were not a property owner, effectively. Right? So how many people could actually vote? Well, it's relatively small. But still, we say that maybe it's a process, because what did the Constitution do over the course of the next 200 years? It slowly makes it possible for other people to vote by removing the liabilities that had been placed upon them. Right? So following the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, it became possible for African Americans to vote. But that was only in principle. There was a gap there, because effectively they couldn't vote. If they tried to vote, the Ku Klux Klan would appear and just terrorize them, which it did. And that's why you needed the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is specifically intended for African Americans to be able to vote. I mean, if you've read how difficult it was for a black person living in the South to go and cast his or her vote, you did it at the possible risk to your life. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when you had the constitutional right to vote. You had the constitutional right, but you did it at the risk to your life. And that was why you needed the federal government to pass another act and say, we're going to actually enforce it. We're going to send federal marshals, and we're going to enforce it. Right? So this is where we say it's a work in progress. And that's why I wouldn't agree with those who would say, oh, well, yeah, the US has never been a democracy, and similarly, India has never been a democracy. Well, no, I think that these are evolving institutions, but we can't be complacent, because, of course, everything is an evolving institution as well. So then, that answer is also readily available, and so we have to then say, well, what is the pace at which it evolves? Yes, I think you had your hand up there. Yeah.
So what is this process supposed to lead to?
What is a process supposed to lead to? Well, that's where we go back to, for example, the question of equality. Is there some fundamental relationship between democracy and equality? In the United States, I think the answer is no, there isn't. I'm sorry, but I think that's the tacit consensus that this country agreed upon 250 years. There is no relationship, according to Americans, between democracy and equality. There are some who will simply modify and say equality of opportunity, that is all that a democracy owes to you. It does not owe you anything else. It may owe you other things beyond the question of equality, right? So you should be able to, for example, go to the polling station on November 4th and be able to cast your vote and not fear for your life. Right? That's what a democracy owes to you. But that, frankly, is a very, very skimpy definition and expectation of what a democracy is. Yes?
Can you maybe draw a harder difference between the opportunity of equality versus equality? Because
opportunity of equality? Yeah.
Just equality, you say there isn't equality here?
Well, why don't you explain a little bit more about what exactly you have in mind when you say opportunity of equality, right? Okay. What does that mean? Substantively, what does that really mean, right? So this is why I gave an illustration whereby I said that, well, you know, you could say that, look, in this system, the principle is that everyone has a chance to rise, in principle. Now, I don't believe that for a second. I don't believe that there's even remotely the case that that is true of this country or any other country for that matter. You know.
I feel like you're
Yeah.
kind of arguing or leaning towards like a welfare state.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Right? But supposing I were, then you could say, well, what's the crime in that? But now we don't have time to, you know, this is not now a class on, let's say, on socialism, okay, and what are the merits of socialism or not, right? But if that were the case, you can say, well, what's necessarily the crime in that? But I'm not actually arguing for a welfare state, right? Because I know very well from my understanding of what happened in welfare states in the 20th century was that most of these states became what are called, had what is called state capitalism, where the state itself became, okay, the largest capitalist enterprise. And that was certainly true of the Soviet Union. It was true of many of the countries in what is called the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe. Okay? So their difficulty is there. And again, if we were doing a course in comparative politics, then we might say, well, what are all the problems with socialist states, with totalitarian states, with authoritarian states? We're not engaged in that exercise. I'm simply trying to alert you to the fact that if we offer a very minimal description and we say one person, one vote, that this is what a democracy is, and let's add a little bit there, for example, but that's implicit in that, and that is that a democracy includes a system of representation. Because clearly if you have 400 plus people sitting in the House of Representatives and 100 people sitting in the Senate, right? And then, of course, as the population continues to grow, there have been, by the way, 100 senators for a very long period of time. I mean, so whenever a new state comes, you have got two senators. The last two states were Alaska and Hawaii, right? So now you've had 100 senators for decades, because that's how it's fixed. But of course, the number of people they're representing has grown astronomically, hasn't it? Right? So then, but those are technical problems. They're technical problems where you might say, well, does it make any sense to have only 100 people in the Senate now, given that the population of the United States is vastly higher than what it was 60, 70, 80 years ago? Okay? And what does it mean for so-and-so to represent? And then we can complicate the picture further and say, well, who's really representing whom? If they're representative, why is it that the Senate has always been called the Millionaires Club, which it is? Virtually everyone who sits in the United States Senate is a millionaire. As far as I'm aware, most of us are not millionaires. And certainly UCLA professors are not, unless they're professors in the law school probably, you know, okay? Or in the economics department, because these are worthy disciplines apparently, you know. But that's the fact of the matter is that, well, the vast majority of people are not millionaires. So how come everyone who sits in the Senate is a millionaire and is representing people who are not, right? You see, we could just keep on going down that road and say, well, what does it mean? Because what it means is it tells you something about a system whereby you now need $50 million to even run for the Senate. Minimum $50 million bucks. And then it means, then you ask questions, well, what are the corporate interests? Who's funding this guy? Right? And so is this person genuinely representative? So forth and so on. Yes?
It seems when in relation to India, in comparison like to the United States, how democracy there versus the United States developed, it seems India from the start
yeah.
knew, like I guess Nehru and many of the leaders of the Congress knew that maybe equality of opportunity wouldn't suffice.
Yeah.
And they took a lot of directives to try and incorporate the people of lower caste
yes.
into the government. But I guess the question that was later raised as history progressed is, did the affirmative action for women, for lower class people actually help, bridge representation to them? Because, like, for instance, India has, like, they have had female prime ministers, or they've had women represented in the Congress.
Yeah.
But, like, there still has a lower life expectancy for women.
Okay, well, big question, right? I mean, the question here is that, and your instinct in moving us to that is right, which is that, okay, now, because what we're doing is we're laying out some general observations to help us think. And what you're saying is that, well, okay, what about the case of India? I mean, okay, so when we talk about equality of opportunity, wasn't there a realization right from the outset that, well, there isn't that? And so therefore, what do you have? You have reservations, what you call affirmative action here. Affirmative action here is hugely insignificant in comparison to reservations in India. We're going to speak about that in very great detail in this course, okay? Because there are certain states in India where the reservations are 80%, 80%. I mean, affirmative action is only for, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of the population effectively here. That's what we're saying, okay? Right? Affirmative action for example, African Americans. But that means, of course, those who are at the lower end there too. I mean, if you're a black professor at Harvard, you don't need affirmative action. Right? But in India, we're saying that there are states where affirmative action, that's not the phrase that is used there, they call it reservation system. You reserve seats, okay, where the reservations are up to 80%. At the federal level, it cannot be more than 50%. It's 49.5% in India, right? But we'll get to that later on, right? Now, let's move to, so I've just laid out a few considerations for you to think about. What is the relationship between, for example, democracy and representation, democracy and equality, okay? And this leads us to the next set of questions. Now, so there are two questions, one which has been anticipated here, but before I get to that, I want to ask another set of questions. So what is it in the experience of India that prepared the people for this experiment in democracy? Very few people actually ask that question. If you look at the United States in the 18th century, well, there were things that slowly were preparing the people for that. So there was resistance to something called the Stamp Act. If for those of you who remember your American history, okay? There was a resistance to the Sugar Act. There were resistance to all of these acts which basically made conditions difficult for the colonists. And so they gradually built up, and there was self-government. There were town hall meetings, even before the Articles of Confederation were written up, which then eventually led to, of course, a constitution, right? Now, what was there in the experience of India that facilitated the experiment in democracy? And I want to pose that question to you because I want to suggest to you that in some ways, this is the most daring experiment that we know of in 20th century history. An electorate that large, largely illiterate. You have to add that. Because one does expect that in a democracy, if you're going to make, somebody here introduced, Dominic was saying choice. That was the first remark that he offered, right? That, well, a democracy, it's not simply a matter of voting, but you're offered a choice of candidates. Now, so if you're offered a choice, therefore you should be in the position to be able to exercise that choice, make an educated assessment, correct? Otherwise, what would the choice mean? It would mean nothing. If you were offered the choice between organic food and non-organic food and, fed only on certain cows and this and that, you know how if you go to places here and there are like 20 labels down, gluten-free, this free, that free, right? Well, if you didn't understand any of that, the choice would mean nothing. If you're illiterate, how do you exercise a choice? And you have to remember that literacy in India at the turn of independence is appallingly low. 20%. That's what we're talking about. Life expectancy was 29. And in the census of India, 1941, life expectancy in India was 29. Right? Okay? So this is, I'm suggesting to you, an extraordinary experiment. It's an extraordinary, unparalleled experiment that we're really speaking about. Yes?
Wasn't there like just the resistance they had against the British, and that was building up to some?
Of course, there is. I haven't concluded my analysis yet. of what it is that might have prepared it. But there are things, so you've got anti-colonial resistance. You've got anti-colonial resistance, although remember that this is true of British India, not of princely India. 1/3 of the country is princely states which are now going to be absorbed. And then again, anti-colonial resistance was not uniform throughout the country. Okay, it's not uniform throughout the country. So there are peasants who are involved in anti-colonial resistance, but how does anti-colonial resistance necessarily prepare all of these people for the experiment in democracy? So for example, here you had town hall meetings, okay? And you had a relatively high level of literacy, relatively. Even in the 1770s, you had a relatively high rate of literacy. And remember, 1770s, you would expect the literacy to be much lower. Now you're talking about the 1940s. And it's still exceedingly low. Okay? So was there something in the past of India that facilitated this exercise? And you could say, well, some nationalists said, well, we had democratic institutions in India long before the British even came. You know, we had what was called the panchayat raj, but the word panchayat is, so let me just write it here. You're going to hear about this later on as well. Panchayat Raj. Raj means rule. Panchayat is the village council, usually comprised of the 5 elders who have been voted to that panchayat. Okay, and usually it meant 5 elders who were men. And all right, I'm going back to antiquity. So Panchayat Raj would be self-rule, autonomous rule at the local level. And there were Indian nationalists who said, well, we had institutions of Panchayat Raj which go back 2,000 years. All right? However you want to assess that claim. And then, of course, there was this whole argument of anti-colonial resistance. But I'm saying, viewed in the totality of things, we have to understand that this is an extraordinarily unique experiment, where you've got a huge number of people coming into freedom, and you've got many of them coming from princely states being absorbed into this one country, and now you're going to have universal suffrage, and they had universal suffrage in just a handful of countries. A handful of countries in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Most countries did not allow women to vote. In Switzerland, women did not vote. In the cantons, there are still cantons until quite recently. I'm talking about a few years ago, a couple of cantons where women didn't vote. You know, okay? Right? So, and now it's not just freedom, but now what we're also adding to this picture is this idea of universal suffrage. Right? So this, viewed in totality, it seems to me that one must recognize this experiment as being wholly unique and distinct in many ways. Okay? Now, the second aspect, broadly, and this will conclude our overview of some observations about democracy, has to do with the comment that was offered here, and that is that we have to think, and it's related to some comments that I've made, but we have to think about how was the Indian state going to make democracy a hospitable idea for everyone? What if you were a woman? What if you were a Dalit? Dalit is the lower caste people. What if you were scheduled caste or scheduled tribe? That might be an odd phrase. Let me write it for you and explain what it means, because you will encounter this in the literature, and the sooner you know what it means, the better it is. Scheduled tribe and scheduled caste. In India, by the way, let me tell you right away, if you want to do Indian politics, learn the acronyms. Everything, you know, you read a newspaper, the front page of the newspaper, there'll be like 50 acronyms. And if you don't know the acronyms, CPI. You know, they'll never tell you what CPI stands for. They just assume that the reader knows it. Communist Party of India. CPM, Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. You know, there are 50 communist parties, by the way, in India, okay? So it's not one party, you know, right? Everything splinters in India, everything. So, right? So SCs. SCs, and this is STs. So you'll see a literature which will say, what do we do with the OBCs, SCs, and STs? Yeah, what kind of sentence is that, you might say? You know, if you don't know the acronyms, OBCs, other backward castes, other backward classes, right? SCs, what is a schedule? Schedule is simply a list. It's like a train schedule, right? Same word. A list which is appended to the Constitution of India, and it listed all these castes and tribes. I'll tell you what castes are later on, okay? But it would list all the castes and tribes that were entitled to reservation. That is, that people who could claim to be members of these groups, were therefore in principle entitled to some beneficial action by the state on their behalf. And translated into simpler English, it simply meant that, so for example, in an educational institution, let's say the equivalent of UCLA, University of Delhi, okay, a huge university, if you were a member of a SC or ST, it meant that 20%, 10%, whatever the percentage was that was agreed upon, that certain percentage of the seats, so if the university is going to admit 5,000 students, and you say 20% of the seats are reserved for SCs and STs, it means that 1,000 of the students who are going to be admitted that year must come from this group of people. Okay? And we're not even now talking about women and OBCs and, you know, all that. Okay? That's what it meant to be SCs and STs. So let's go back to the primary question we're involved in, because, of course, if we got into the details, we could have a whole course on just this and say, well, what has been the history of how they've been treated? What were the policies in different states? To what extent were they accommodated? Did it lead to bitterness among the upper castes? Right? You can imagine, right? I mean, all you have to think of is think of some of the objections people raise to affirmative action in this country. And you're only talking about really affirmative action for a very small number of people. Here you're talking about hundreds of millions of people, and if you put them all together, they constitute the majority of the country, the majority of the population. Right? So, for example, if you say that we're going to have 1,000, so we gave a random figure and we said 20% of the seats are going to be reserved, and you had 50%, 5,000 students you were going to admit at University of Delhi. We're taking random figures. Well, in order to admit 1,000 SCs and STs, the critics would have said, let's hope that there are enough of them who even went to high school. Right? Because before you can get to university, presumably you have to go to high school, don't you? Right? So how are we going to fill these seats if we don't even have enough candidates who have gone to high school? And this is one institution. What if you're talking about 100 institutions where you have a similar policy? So do we have 500,000 SCs or STs who can be admitted? And if they can't be admitted because we just don't have any, what does it mean? It means corruption in capital letters. There are going to be people who will get in even though they're not SCs or STs, or they'll falsify their papers. And it became rampant corruption. Right? We can, as I said, complicate every situation here endlessly if we want to. But we want to just keep the broader consideration in mind now, and that broader consideration is, so the question that was posed was, what did Indian democracy do? And I think that's a fair question. Absolutely fair question. What did Indian democracy do? What has it done for people who are at the margins, who are SCs, STs, Dalits, OBCs, other backward classes, women, okay? And what happens, India is unique in this respect. The illustration I will give you will clarify that immediately. In most societies, there are people who try to raise themselves up. Okay? Of course, everybody wants to do that in India too. But one of the ways in which you raise yourself up in India is you officially try to show that you are lower down the ladder than you actually are. What do I mean by that? That let's supposing you belong to a caste community which is not recognized as being part of an SC. So what do? You try to show that historically you were always a member of this underprivileged group, because that's the only way that you can get affirmative action. Yeah? So there are people who are actually upper castes who have been desperately trying to show themselves off as lower castes in India. I'm not saying that every upper caste group tries to do that. Please don't mistake me to say that this is a strategy of every upper caste group. But this is the strategy of some groups. And this is, again, completely unique. It's wholly distinct. Yes? Well, look, there are people who do it at an individual level in the sense that, let's supposing you were not entitled to food stamps because you fell below the threshold. So you might want to show yourself off as poorer than you are so you can get food stamps. At an individual level, people will do it. I'm saying this is a systematic strategy of an entire community. There's a difference. There's a difference. Because you have to remember that there's a price to be paid for that too. The price to be paid is that there's a stigma attached to being. Right? It's not all hunky-dory. Okay, you get your reservation, now I can just comfortably. No, but you don't really want to be considered by everybody else to be a member of a scheduled caste because there are liabilities in being a scheduled caste. Yes, there are benefits. The benefit is that the state has reserved a certain percentage of the seats for you. If there were only benefits, why wouldn't everyone want to claim to be SC or ST? There are huge liabilities, okay, with that as well. So you have to calculate the risks. And this is not a matter of an individual choice here only. I'm saying these are systematic strategies by entire communities. Yes?
So there's liability. So is it like made public that you're part of a certain schedule?
Oh, yeah. Because, there's a whole community and then the community would become known, and you would then, you could then get yourself listed as a SC or ST, but then the stigma, because there's a...
Once you go off to college, you're labeled.
Oh, yeah, of course. You can, because, you can identify a person by their caste name. I mean, I can do that 90% of the time, but there are people who can do it 100% of the time. All you have to do is give a name and you can say, and by the way, I mean, we're talking about over 5,000 caste communities. So who's who on the pecking order? I mean, yeah.
Well, you answered. I was going to ask, well, how does everybody know what caste you're in? I mean, isn't the...
Oh, you can tell from the name, usually. You can tell from the name, but then, of course, what you do is you try to disguise the name. You change. Well, you can. But you see, then again, let's suppose, okay, so we are getting into all kinds of things that will come up later on, but now, since it's come up, let me answer the question. Yes, you can. You can go and legally change your name. Okay? However, look at it this way. Say you live in a village, and you're called Bittu Saigal, and you go and have your changed name to Ronald Reagan. Okay? Right? Well, that doesn't mean that suddenly now you're Ronald Reagan, because everybody knows who you are. You're going to have to not just change your name. You happen to be the lowest, you belong to the lowest caste. And if all it did to become upwardly mobile was to go to the court, pay the fee to have your name changed, well, again, everybody would go and have their name changed. No. Because when you're living in that village, it doesn't matter whether you change your name, everybody knows who you are. You might have to actually just leave the village altogether. Well, that's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? Because that means leaving your family, your attachment, your land, whatever the case might be. Right? That's the problem you're going to run into. I'm giving you a very simple answer. It's never that simple. Never that simple, I mean, why didn't every African American change their name? Because you know what, African Americans, they all lost their African names. They were all given the names of who? The slave owners. You acquired the name of your slave owner. Why did Malcolm call himself Malcolm X? That's the whole idea. You don't want to take on the liability of your slave owner's name. You want to get rid of that past. But he did it. Not everybody did it. 99.999% African Americans didn't do it. Why didn't they all go around calling themselves Jeffrey X, Jeffrey B, Jeffrey Y? or Smith A or whatever the case? No. You know, because again, changing a name, it's not simply a legal matter and going to the court and paying the $50. The whole else is involved. Do you change your personality altogether? What are the psychological impacts? So forth and so on. Okay? So the question broadly here then is, what is it that facilitated this exercise, this experiment in democracy, right? And the second set of questions, which we will address incrementally, we will address them incrementally when we take up, for example, the question of caste. Then we will address that question again. We will address it incrementally when we take up the question of the working class in India, or when we take up the question of Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, and so forth and so on. Right? What did democracy do right at the outset, and what has it continued to do for all of these different constituencies and groups, particularly those who have been at the margins? Okay, now, and this will complete my overview with my remarks today on the Constitution of India, because then what we're going to do beginning next week is we're going to start looking in greater detail at particular sets of questions. So, for example, next week we're going to look at the whole question of economics, economic well-being, right? How has a country fared from 47 down to, right, the present day? But today, in my remaining remarks today, what I want to do is I want to talk about the Constitution of India and how the Constitution came to be drawn up, and what kind of document is a constitution. I think to some extent you can anticipate what kind of document it is, because if it is a democracy, right, then its constitution is somewhat like, of course, the Constitution of the United States. It's much bigger. One of the most distinctive things about the United States Constitution is how small it is. It's a very small document. I mean, you're talking about 20, 30 pages, and how few amendments there are to the US Constitution. I mean, an amendment comes about once every 20 years now. The first 10 amendments, of course, are Bill of Rights, which was immediate, almost immediate, right? But then the other amendments were much slower, right, and took decades, some of them. And the United States Constitution has not had a new amendment for decades now. The Indian Constitution, on the other hand, is the longest document of its kind. Right? It runs into several hundred pages. And I'm not going to even pretend to have read the whole Constitution. I haven't. I've read some key portions, which are obviously critical for the discussion, not just today, but critical for the kind of work that I do. But only people who are really constitutional lawyers have read the entire Constitution of India. Okay? And how was it drafted? Well, they did look at constitutions of a number of other countries. Not Britain, because Britain does not have a written constitution. I hope you know that. Britain does not have a written constitution. It has what is called an unwritten constitution, okay, where such things as precedent matter a lot. So precedent is, well, one way you decide upon a certain practice, certain course of action, is you look at what is called precedent. And of course they have things like the Magna Carta, but the Magna Carta is not the British Constitution. Yes. Yeah. No, but that's not a constitution. No. That's a document that goes back 800 years, but it's not the Constitution of Great Britain. What you have is an unwritten constitution where precedent is the key thing, right? So if you want to understand what is a law in Britain regarding property, then you look at precedent. Well, how do we know what the precedent is? You basically look at how courts have ruled on this matter over a very long period of time. Okay? So when they compiled the Constitution of India, they did study various other constitutions that were in place, including the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Irish Free State, and the Constitution of countries such as Australia. The Indian Constitution itself, by the way, has now been studied in countries where they have drawn up a constitution much more recently. The most famous case being, of course, the case of South Africa. Right? When South Africa became a free country and the end of apartheid happened in the early 1990s, and they had to draft a new constitution for South Africa. So one of the constitutions they studied in South Africa in great detail was the Constitution of India. Now, the way the Constitution of India was drawn up was they first appointed what is called a constituent assembly. So a constituent assembly was drawn up before India became free. It was drawn up in December of 1946. December of 1946. 308 males to be precise. Okay, 308 men, largely upper caste Hindus, many of them Brahmins, upper caste, some Muslims, some Parsis, so forth and so on. Okay, people representing other religious groups, but predominantly comprised of Hindus and upper caste Hindus at that. Okay, and what they did was they then obviously studied these constitutions, and I have to say that there was the Constituent Assembly debates are actually absolutely fascinating. I mean, they're thrilling, frankly, because what the Constituent Assembly had to do was to come up with a constitution under the circumstances that I've now described to you. That this is a wholly new experiment of a kind for which there's no precedent anywhere in the world. Right? You want to give universal suffrage, for example. Well, what is the precedent for that? What constitutions permit that? What do you do when you have an electorate that's that big? What do you do when you have groups that have been historically underrepresented, underprivileged, right, for decades, for generations, for centuries? Because you do want to become a sovereign republic, and in fact, actually, India was going to be what was called a sovereign socialist republic. Let me read out to you a couple of things from the Constitution. Okay, so I'm going to read out what is called the preamble, and we'll just look at it very briefly and see what it really means. Okay, so this is what the preamble to the Constitution says. We, the people of India, we, the people of India, right? Because you always have to ask who's the we. So here it's specified, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, mark the words, sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. And by the way, I'm deeply suspicious. Whenever I see phrases like these, it's a mouthful. Sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic, right? Each of these, we could spend hours and hours trying to figure out what secular. Why did they have to put the word secular? Was it put in right away? But before we get to the details, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political. So it says that we will secure to the people justice, social, economic, and political. Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. This seems to be relatively uncontroversial, relatively. Okay, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. So you can express whatever views you want. Doesn't matter what religion you have. Of course, within certain constraints is going to be understood. That's one of the things that, as in the United States, you have freedom of speech, but freedom of speech doesn't allow you to stand, hurling abuses at every possible person that you can think of, right? Of course not, right? That's what the courts will then do. Well, is that within your right or not? Could you go calling everybody the worst 4-letter words that you can think of, just because you wanted to do it? Right? So, having resolved to constitute and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, this has to be controversial, because what does that mean? Economic justice. What does that mean? Right? Does it mean equality? But then there's I won't take any questions right now. I want to just go through, because we want to make sure that we have enough information right now about the Constitution. Equality. So now equality is mentioned as a separate category. Secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, etc. Equality of status. and of opportunity. Notice how it's qualified. It doesn't say equality, period. No democracy can promise you that. Right? No democracy can promise you that. It says equality of status. What does that mean? That's not equality of status. It promises you and to secure to all its citizens equality of status and of opportunity. We know what equality of opportunity means in principle. We also know there's a big gap between whether it actually is, whether there is equality of opportunity or not. If you come from a Dalit family living in a remote part of village India and you have to walk 10 miles to be able to get tap water, there's no equality of opportunity. Because that morning that you should be spending going to school, you're going to be walking to that tap, which is 10 miles away, and then walking back, and by the time you get back, it's late afternoon, and you're not going to be going to school. I can guarantee you that. Right? So we know there's a big gap between what it says and whether there is equality of opportunity, and that's true here too. There's a big gap. But what does equality of status mean? What does that mean? Anybody? Yeah.
Does it relate to breaking down the older notion of caste that they have? Trying to get rid of caste discrimination?
But it doesn't say equality of status or equality of all the castes. Let's supposing they meant only castes. So instead of saying status, they could have said equality of all castes and of opportunity. Right? So it has to be broader than that. I think you would agree. Okay? Because if they meant only caste, I'm not saying that you're wrong, but that perhaps you may be giving a more restrictive answer than what they had in mind. Yes?
Regardless of what religion you practice, of what caste you are used to be.
What does status mean? What does status mean to you in general?
Position in society.
Position in society. And usually if you had to add an adjective before that, which word would you? Class. Class status. So equality of status means that in principle, the Constitution is saying that it doesn't matter whether you're a bricklayer or you're flipping burgers or you're a Harvard professor or you're CEO of a Silicon Valley startup, you all have equal status in the eyes of the Constitution, which of course is complete hogwash. That's not the case, not even remotely, either in India or in the US for that matter. Okay? At least not from the standpoint of my politics, it isn't. There's no equality of status in that sense because there is a big difference between where you come from, what liabilities you carry, what's the color of your skin, right? What's the level of your education, so forth and so on. You could say that in some societies it matters less, in some societies it matters more. But again, now, you see, if we went down the road of saying that there's a gap, there will always be a gap, so that might not be very productive. Maybe we should just take it as a given that there's going to be a gap and it's going to be big. And we could start by saying that the fact that Constitution at all says this is in fact actually interesting and perhaps admirable, because the Constitution you could have said, that's why the background, remember what I told you about the people who are a member of the Constituent Assembly? They're upper caste Hindu males. They could all have said, hey, to hell with the lower caste, to hell with women, you know, why should we even bother? Why shouldn't we just protect our own interests? Now, of course, I think it's, if you're engaging in a democratic exercise, you can't take that view. Clearly, you can't take that view. And so on the opposite side, someone who could say, well, the fact that they actually say equality of status, this is the least they had to do. That's the other side of it. And I think that that's also an argument that one might want to take seriously, that this is the least they had to do, because in principle, that is what a modern system of law is like as well. And what a constitution is, it has to be also understood within the ambit of a larger legal system. Right? What is the distinctive aspect of a modern legal system? The most distinctive aspect of a modern legal system is the fact that it is in principle neutral. In principle. That it doesn't matter if you got caught with 50 grams of cocaine, and it doesn't matter whether you happen to be the President of the United States who got caught with it, or you happen to be somebody living in the ghetto, or you happen to be from South Central LA, in principle, the modern legal system stipulation is it's the same offense. And if it's the same offense, there should be the same punishment for it, with some qualification, the qualification being that if this was the third time that you were caught doing that, well, maybe the punishment might be greater, okay? 3 strikes law, remember, in California, famous for that, right? So if you steal chickens, and the third time you steal chickens, well, okay, we're going to put you away for 20 years. Yeah. But in principle, that is what a modern legal system is. It is a system of neutrality. If you cross the red light, it doesn't matter who you are. It's the same offense. You should get the same ticket. Now, we know that that doesn't happen. We know that, for example, if you get caught with 5 grams of cocaine in your pocket and you're black, the likelihood that you're going to be sent away is 50 times greater than if you're white and caught with the same amount of coke. Okay? We know that. I mean, this has been shown by innumerable number of studies. Okay? So the most material thing here is simply that this Constitution has to be understood as a document that is part of a modern legal system. It's not just shaping that system. Many people interpret it as giving shape to the laws. It assumes the edifice of modern legal thinking. And that's why equality of status and of opportunity is important. And then finally, I'm going to just read out the rest of this. And to promote among them all fraternity. So we the people have resolved to constitute ourselves into socialist, secular, etc., republic, and to secure to our citizens justice, liberty, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, fraternal engagement, right? Conviviality, feeling of brotherhood and sisterhood, fraternity assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. Interesting, that part. The unity and integrity of the nation, that we have resolved to secure to our people not only their own dignity as individuals, but to assure them the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, we do adopt this Constitution. Power, okay? So the further assumption is that power is vested in the people. Because we the people did this, power is vested in the people, and we have given ourselves this Constitution and have the power to change it. The word socialist, by the way, was not part of the preamble. It was added to the Constitution by the 42nd Amendment, 25 years later. It was not part of this preamble. That we have resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. So why was the word socialist added much later on? We'll get to that when we get to the 1970s. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to say a few more things about the Constitution and the work of the Constituent Assembly, what kind of fundamental rights it guarantees, and some aspects of it that are really quite unique to India, and then immediately move on to the next segment. So we're pretty much caught up. We're just 10-15 minutes behind schedule, more or less. And next week, you do the readings that you have for that week.